Hello, everyone, and welcome to this podcast introduction to this week's program, Listening to America. Today, I have a conversation with one of my favorite people in the world, Russ Eagle of Salisbury, North Carolina, about phase 2 of my John Steinbeck tour of the United States. I've been back for a few days now. I'm off to England on my annual European cultural tour, Literary England, with my daughter, Catherine. When I get back, I will pop right back into the Airstream, which I'm looking at outside my kitchen window here. It's out on the street. I've taken everything in and washed everything. I've downsized dramatically. I've brought in several hundred pounds worth of gear. I took too much. I took way too much on phase 1. I took about 2/3 of that on phase 2, and I'm going to take about half of that on the third and final phase of the year. I'm learning to live minimally. With the more stuff you have, the more trouble that it really amounts to. You know, how do you find that recording microphone, and how do you find those SD cards, and where exactly did I put that notebook, and how many colored pencils do you really need, and do you really need 4 sets of sheets, or would 2 or even 1 be enough? And all these things you have to learn. You know, I'm a maximalist, I suppose you would say, in life, and now I'm having to be a minimalist with respect to this great journey. It's been absolutely fabulous. I have no complaints whatsoever, except gas prices, and they're not really that expensive if you do the math compared to, say, what they were when I was a teenager. Adjusted for inflation, adding in federal, state, and local gasoline taxes, it's about the same, interestingly enough. I've met some extraordinary people, some along the way, some people that I've known for a long time, new friends, old friends. I've had a chance to really look at this continent, how huge it is, just the distances and how empty the continent is. So, you know, I left in phase 2, I left Bismarck, and I went to the Badlands, which Steinbeck, he didn't particularly like the Badlands of western North Dakota. Then I stayed at Beach, where he stayed at the Westgate Motel. It's now empty and being remodeled, and who knows into what. I hope it'll be a Steinbeck theme motel, but that's far from clear. Then I went to the Little Bighorn, where Steinbeck spent a short amount of time on his journey, and then across the Yellowstone Valley to Missoula and beyond. I did stop at Pompey's Pillar, which is a Lewis and Clark site, because, you know, you can't go by Pompey's Pillar without wanting to stop there too. Met a fascinating antiquarian in Billings and had dinner with him, and got to see his really remarkable collection of historic documents, many of them related to the history of Montana. Then on into Idaho and Washington. I went to Grand Coulee Dam, which I think I saw 35 years ago, and it was a hot, hot day, but I was glad to be there. Then up to Seattle and the Olympic Peninsula, where my friend the farmer nearly burned up the rig, but all's well that ends well. Then I had to kind of race down, unfortunately, but I did stop at Ashland to see Macbeth. I'd never been to Ashland before. I'll be back, I can promise you that. I stopped at the Newport Beach Sylvia Beach Hotel on the coast and stayed in the Steinbeck room, which was great fun. Then I went to the Redwoods, which are just absolutely stunning. They're just stunning. And on down to the Bay Area and to Salinas, where I gave a talk at the National Steinbeck Center. And then I made my way to Bakersfield, which is where Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath's Weed Patch Camp, the Arvin camp, was located. Then over to Hatcherby Pass, which is essential to the story of the Jodes in the Grapes of Wrath. And then on to Route 66. And I had to stop there because I had to go to Vail for a thing I do 4 times per year, moderating conversations on controversial issues. This one was on what happened to sports in America. And then I came home for a few days, for a couple of weeks actually, by way of the Cache de Poudre River in northeastern Colorado, and then Devil's Tower, which one of my favorite places. It's a national monument, the first actually, designated by none other than Theodore Roosevelt. And then on to Ekalaka, Montana, one of the great names, Ekalaka, which means holes in the rocks, a Lakota word, and it's called Medicine Rock State Park, and then home. Now I'm home. I've done some other speaking and traveling whilst I'm home, and I will leave next week for London for my annual European cultural tour, this one on Literary England, which I co-host with my daughter Catherine. When I get back, I will get over my jet lag in about one day, unfortunately, and then get back in the rig and go to Arches National Park and Canyonlands National Park. I'm doing a cultural retreat, my annual Lochsaw Lodge retreats, one on Shakespeare this winter in January and the other one. And by the way, the Shakespeare one I think has a couple of places available because someone had to drop out. So do check that out at ltamerica.org. And the second one is on Edward Abbey and Henry David Thoreau. So I'm going to Arches and Canyonlands, and I will actually be meeting with some people who knew Edward Abbey, who wrote the famous book Desert Solitaire, and also the novel The Monkey Wrench Gang. So I've been reading biographies of Edward Abbey, and I just reread Desert Solitaire and his famous essay Down the River with Henry Thoreau, and so on. What a treat all of that is. And then I'll pick up the journey again from there, going to Williams and Winslow on Route 66 and on to Amarillo, and then on to Austin and Fort Worth, not in that order, of course, and then New Orleans, where I'll catch up with Russ and Liz Eagle for what Liz promises as the best and only authentic gumbo in America. Can't wait for that. And then I'll finish up by making a civil rights tour of Selma and Montgomery and Birmingham, and I'm going to store the rig in Salisbury, North Carolina at an RV storage facility for the winter, and then come home in time for Thanksgiving. And I'll have so very, very much to be thankful for. So Russ knows his Steinbeck. We talk almost all the time. We text almost every day. He helps me when I'm searching for information. He's my reality check on my theories and insights, I hope insights, about Steinbeck and Travels with Charley. And so it's a pleasure. We've done, I think, 2 or 3 previous programs on my Steinbeck tour, and it's always a pleasure to speak with him. So let's go to the program. Again, if you want to come to the Shakespeare Cultural Retreat, go to ltamerica.org. Follow along at everything we're doing at our Facebook site, Listening to America, or my own Facebook site under my name, and sign up for our weekly newsletter and contribute gas cards and new pickups and anything else that you can. It's been a little hard on the old 2013 GMC Sierra pickup. It's just barely powerful enough to pull a 23-foot Airstream up Tehachapi Pass, as I discovered when I nearly had a kind of a Jode-like experience of overheating the rig. All is well. I couldn't be happier. I'm sorry that I have to interrupt the journey, but such is life, and I can't wait to get back out on the road. So we'll see you soon. Let's go to Russ Eagle asking the tough questions about phase 2 of my Travels with Charley tour.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson. I'm your guest host this week, Russ Eagle. Clay's been on the road now for, I think it's about 5 months with his Airstream in tow, following John Steinbeck's route from 1960 with his dog Charley. And I know Clay's been writing a lot about his journey on the website, but we haven't checked in with him here, I think, since mid-May, so we thought it was about time. So, Clay, I can see you in my monitor, and it doesn't look like you're in your rig at this moment.
I wish I were, Russ. I'm in Bismarck between phase 2 and phase 3. So I'm doing the Steinbeck trip in 3 phases. I began on April 27th from Bismarck, went to Long Island, and then worked my way back as he did. Took a few weeks off, and then did phase 2 from July 5th until August 30th. Now I've been home for a few days, and as you know, I'm going to England to lead my annual cultural tour, and so I won't get back on the road to finish up the Steinbeck trip until October 3rd, and I'll finish that phase 3 at Norfolk, Virginia in November, and then, as you know, I'm going to park the Airstream in your hometown, Salisbury, North Carolina, for the winter. So that'll be the complete Steinbeck trip. But for the moment, I'm in my hometown of Bismarck. But I can see out my window, Russ, the 23-foot silver Airstream with the logo "Listening to America" on the side, and in front of it my somewhat beleaguered 2013 GMC Sierra pickup.
And you say, you take a few weeks off, but, I know some of what you do. You're going to England during this time off. You hiked and canoed the Lewis and Clark Trail. So when you say you take time off, you're not sitting in your living room.
There are no tiddlywinks in my life, Russ. I suppose you would say I'm a workaholic, but I got back and then I immediately went out to the Badlands because I hosted or helped to host the annual Theodore Roosevelt Symposium in Jenkinson at the TR Center there. And now I'm here and I'm going back to the Badlands this weekend for a Smithsonian adventure tour that they're doing. And then late next week, I will fly to London for the Literary England tour, which I will host with my daughter. So there's no rest, but I don't mind. I'm having the time of my life here.
And where did you leave the Steinbeck Trail at the end of phase 2?
I left it roughly at Williams, Arizona. I was on Route 66. So phase 2 took me from Bismarck to Seattle, from Seattle to Monterey and Salinas, from there to Bakersfield, where, by the way, I saw Weed Patch, the government camp from the Grapes of Wrath. And then I made my way over to Route 66, which is not exactly on Steinbeck's trail, but it's important to Steinbeck for other reasons. And then I had to get back, and so I had an event in Vail that I had to get to. So then I drove north to Cortez, which is a wonderful place in southwestern Colorado, and then to Vail. And while at Vail, I stayed in a great hotel, but I parked the rig and then drove back to North Dakota. So when I start phase 3, I will go back to Williams and pick up the road from there.
Steinbeck was the one that coined the phrase "the Great Mother Road" about Route 66. What's it like today on Route 66? Is the experience still there in any sense?
Yes, it's surprising. So most of Route 66 has been obliterated by Interstate 40, and that's really what's happened to many of those old trunk roads that existed before the Interstate Highway Act of 1955, the Eisenhower Autobahn system. And so Route 66 still exists. It was officially decommissioned in 1985, but there are sections of it that you can still drive, quite a few actually. And the most colorful of them are in Arizona and New Mexico and to Amarillo. Then after that, it sort of fades into the interstate system more or less. One of the highlights of my entire journey was a couple of weeks ago, and I had been in Needles, and I went to Needles for obvious Steinbeckian reasons. We can come back to that. It was 110 degrees. It was, it's been a pretty hot summer in America. And so that was the hardest night of the entire journey. I actually couldn't sleep that night. But then the next day I drove Route 66 towards Arizona, and I stopped by the side of the road. On the road surface, it was probably 120 degrees. And I recorded a little piece, as you know, from one of my favorite passages from the Grapes of Wrath, where Steinbeck, in sort of, well, maybe you can describe it, but sort of in a portentous way, says, here's where the revolution's going to come from.
Right. That was chapter 14. I think it's an odd chapter in the Grapes of Wrath. It's only like 3 or 4 paragraphs. It seems as if Steinbeck decided, I'm going to stop right here and just let people know exactly what's going on. If anybody's missing the point, here it is.
My trip, as you know, is following Travels with Charley from 1960, but I love the Grapes of Wrath, and I love that passage. So the Jodes are on their way to California, and they stop by the side of the road. And then in chapter 14, as you say, Steinbeck says, look, this is how revolution begins. Somebody's squatting by the side of the road, they're camping. Some strangers come up and park, they're squatting by the side of the road. Someone says, I'm hungry, and the other family says, oh, well, here's a little food. Someone says, Grandma's sick, and the other family says, here's a blanket, it was my mother's. And Steinbeck says, that's it, right there. That's where the revolution is going to come from. It's going to be people appalled by the injustices of the economic system, who are going to squat down together in the dust by the side of the road, and from that node, that onlage, he says, that onlog, that kind of embryo, that's where the revolution will come from. You've got it in front of you. Maybe you can quote a section of it.
Yes, he says, "This is the zygote. For here I lost my land is changed. A cell is split, and from its splitting grows the thing you hate. We lost our land. The danger is here, for two men are not as lonely and perplexed as one. And from this first we there grows a still more dangerous thing. I have a little food, plus I have none. If from this problem the sum is we have a little food, the thing is on its way, the movement has direction." And that was really, that's the story Steinbeck was trying to tell, from I to we and the grapes of wrath.
Right, so the phalanx, again with his long, dear friendship with Ed Ricketts, with the idea that the individual is alone and helpless, but when you start to create a small community, that wedge, that phalanx, can change the world. I won't say to you what you said to me when I posted that little, I said, "What, you didn't memorize it?" You're reading too. But, it was bad enough for us. It's 120 degrees out there. I'm on the side of the road. I'm pretty sure that road bandits are going to come and kill me. And so I actually read the passage. But, here's a question for you, not to get too deep in the weeds, but it didn't happen. Steinbeck, The Grapes of Wrath, takes the title from the famous Battle Hymn of the Republic. The idea is that people are going to get so upset that the injustices are going to be so mighty that growers throwing food away and burning pigs and pouring lime on their oranges and refusing to feed the poor, that the people are going to rise up and overthrow that government and build a more equitable economic world. And that's not what happened, is it?
No, what happened was World War II struck. And there's actually...
prosperity.
Right. There's actually an interview that I stumbled across that Steinbeck did with Voice of America about 10 years later. I think a lot of people, the people that tried to, define Steinbeck, what they perceived as leftist politics, would be disappointed to hear this. But Steinbeck sort of admitted, I was really seeing half the picture. I wasn't seeing it from the perspective of people in California who were being overrun by strangers and by taxation and by fear. That was one of Steinbeck's great themes. The more perspectives you gather, the closer you get to the truth. It's sort of like a limit in mathematics,
I'm talking to Russ Eagle. We're talking about my Steinbeck trip in the wake of Travels with Charley from 1960, but we're at the moment talking about Route 66. Russ, we don't know what happens to the Joads at the end of the novel. The family's kind of breaking apart. Tom has to go off because he's wanted for murder, but he's going to be a freedom fighter wherever there's people are hungry. He'll be there, and so on. That famous passage. My sense is, he doesn't want us to know what's going to happen. That's part of his strategy. He didn't like to wrap up his novels into tidy little stories that have a beginning, middle, and then a happy end. But don't we presume that the Joads find employment, they survive, the war comes, the California prosperity soars. I don't think we're meant to think at the end of the novel that they die. No,
but, they're a large group. So, you've got to think there's some hit and miss. The path that Tom chooses at the end, you can easily imagine him meeting a violent death. But yeah, for the most part, I think the Joads moved forward, and there are lots of stories out there of people that did do that. You may have heard some when you were at Weed Patch. There's some great happy endings to the Dust Bowl in California, and of course, as time goes by, more and more of these are dying away. But they are out there. But you're right, Steinbeck, and a lot of people called him lazy for this, but he did not, as he told his editor. There are no fruity climaxes. Life goes on. He liked to stop his novels, to stop at a high point, but there's no end. That was something he believed in, and some people liked it, some people didn't.
Well, he's not attempting, he, as you know, he was always impatient with the novel as a form, beginning, middle, end, as if life is a series of stories that wrap up in that really tidy way. So the novel ends and we're not sure. The flood is still on. Tom has run off. About half the family is gone by the time Steinbeck finally writes the end. So just to go back to the theme, so I'm following his 1960 kind of cheerful journey around the country in a truck camper that he called Rocinante, which we've seen together several times at the Steinbeck Center in Salinas. We don't really know how much time Steinbeck spent on Route 66. I think he exaggerated his time on it a little bit, didn't he? He didn't really follow it from Chicago all the way to Santa Monica to research the great novel.
No, I think over the course of his life, he was probably on most of it, but he covered the majority of it well before this, when he and his wife Carol were driving back from New York after his first earliest success with Tortilla Flat, and then probably the first automobile he owned that could safely travel that distance. But I think at some point probably left the road and headed north toward Monterey.
He helped to make the road famous, but then there was the famous song too, I Get My Kicks. Is it Trope?
The Dorothea Lange photographs also. Clay, we need to take a break, but you did mention going through Steinbeck country and Salinas. I want to touch on that a minute when we get back. You're listening to America with Clay Jenkinson, and we'll be back in a few minutes. Welcome back to Listening to America. This is Russ Eagle. We're talking with Clay Jenkinson, who's relaxing, and I say that in air quotes, at home before returning to the road in the Listening to America Airstream. Clay, you mentioned you were in Salinas, Steinbeck country, and I guess you actually had your rig parked a literal stone's throw from the real thing.
Exactly. So in Salinas, California, population about 200,000, where Steinbeck is buried, there is the National Steinbeck Center. It's the largest interpretive center dedicated to a single author in the United States, and it's right in the heart of the downtown of Salinas. They have his camper. That's a long and interesting story, how they got the truck camper. Steinbeck simply sold it when he got back to New York in 1960, but it survived, been restored, and it's there. It's the treasure of the National Steinbeck Center. They asked me if I'd come and give a talk on August 10th, which, by the way, was my daughter's 30th birthday, and they had me park it right outside the front door. So there it was, within 35 or 40 feet, I suppose, of his rig. But it was a car show going on in Salinas, and they had several $300,000 sports cars also parked out in front. And so the crowds were almost infinitely less interested in my Airstream than they were in these Jaguars and Lamborghinis and Porsches and so on. So I gave a talk there on what I've discovered so far and learned a few things from Lisa, the archivist there. That was great fun. And then I went off to Bakersfield after that. So I'm hoping to do more at the National Steinbeck Center in Salinas. And one of the things I learned and let you know immediately was that they have the drapes, the original drapes from his rig in the basement in a huge box. Apparently the story is that Elaine made draperies for his truck camper, and when they restored it, the draperies were in such bad condition that they couldn't make use of them. So they're downstairs. I've never seen them. I don't think you have either, but we're going to next time we're there.
Right. I guess after 64 years, the majority of it spent doing farm work. I can imagine what condition they're in. You mentioned that you had to hurry to get there. Steinbeck still takes a lot of grief from people who say he rushed through the trip. Are you finding that you can take a leisurely pace? Are you having to hurry from place to place? What is your pace?
My pace is, I'm taking about twice the amount of time that he took, and it's still too fast. I don't know how he did it, frankly. And he had an advantage over me. He was retired in some sense. He had no obligations, so he could travel at whatever pace he wanted. He did have some rendezvous that he had to meet with his wife Elaine, but I think there was some flexibility in all of that. I came, as you know, I broke the trip to come on the Lewis and Clark Trail with you and a group of people. We do it every summer, and it was a fabulous trip this year in spite of some windstorms up in the Bitterroot Mountains. And then I rushed back to the Olympic Peninsula. On July 5th, I left Bismarck. I took the whole system out to the Olympic Peninsula, left the camper, came back in the pickup to join the Lewis and Clark trip, then raced back out to pick up the rig. And now I was only like 4 days before I had to be in Salinas. So those kind of pre-existing dates on my calendar have made a little trouble. in some of it. And so I came down the coast on 101 through the redwoods, which are just absolutely magnificent. Plus, I drove on two highways in California that I had never previously seen, and one of them was along the Klamath River from essentially Wairika to the coast, because I was staying at Fort Bragg down the coast. And that road, which is California 96, is magnificently beautiful, but a little hair-raising. I recommend it for cars, not necessarily for hauling a 23-foot trailer. And then I came down 101 and 1, partly 1, but you can't spend too much time on 1, both because it's falling into the sea in places, but also it's very slow. And then after Salinas, when I was on my way to Bakersfield, I took another road, which I really recommend. You and I should go on it one of these days. I came down 5 to San Lucas, which is just south of Salinas by about 40 or 50 miles, and then on 198 over to Coalinga. And that is one of the most astonishing roads I've ever been on. It's through, California has 40 million people, but none of them live on this highway. It's through these incredible grass mountains and precipitous. So I got there, and then Bakersfield, and that was again on a Grapes of Wrath mission to see Weed Patch, which you can't see much of, I'm sorry to say. And then after that, I went up to Tehachapi Pass, and Tehachapi Pass is so important because that's where the Jodes, coming from the east, look down onto the promised land. And when they've been in the desert, they've been in the Mojave, which at that time was extremely difficult to get across. I mean, cars routinely broke down, overheated. Even in my own lifetime, that was the case. It's no longer really the case. And the road from Bakersfield up to Tehachapi Pass is one of the most steep, precipitous roads that I've ever been on. My pickup was overheating. I had to kind of pony it up that road. And then I turned around, Russ, so that I could come over the pass and look down onto the promised land. And I took some pictures there, and there'll be some video. I don't know if you've ever done that, but it's a pretty amazing sight.
I have done that, but it's been over 20 years now. But yeah, it's something everybody should do. You see people post that photo all the time, but it's one of those places where the photos don't do it justice.
No, even the view doesn't do it justice, because in my mind's eye, and I probably did that pass 35 years ago, so I have no real memory of it. In my mind's eye, the Jodes are coming up to the top of the pass, and then they look down and it's just orchards and green and lettuce fields and so on. It's not quite that. You have to come down about 8 or 9 miles from the top of the pass to really see the agriculture. But at that point, it's exactly what they said. It's hazy, and you see the green, and you see the mists of the fields, and they must have felt at that point, we're saved. There's some deep satisfaction and fulfillment in being in the footsteps of Steinbeck's writing. I know you and I both felt that at Doc's lab in Monterey, or at Point Lobos, which is one of the most beautiful places in the world. So how do you handle that? I mean, I know we're wired a little bit differently on these things, but I know you're very moved by that stuff.
I am, and I think of a few weeks ago, you and I were canoeing through the White Cliffs, and we sort of managed to extricate ourselves from the group, and we were just enjoying it. And you said, how many times can you do this before, it dulls your senses? And I think you can do it a lot. Point Lobos is one place you mentioned. I look forward every year, sometimes several times a year, getting to Point Lobos. It just never ceases to have that effect. And, Steinbeck talked about that up in New England, talking to the woman about the New England Falls. He says, does it ever just become same old to you? And she said, no, you can't remember it. So it's always new when it happens again.
We were on the Lewis and Clark Trail, and we always canoe for 3 days on the White Cliffs section of the Missouri, and then we regroup and we then hike up in the low trail. And you and I are canoe partners normally, and so we were out there, and we had that long second day together, and we got away we didn't try to, but we got ahead of the group. I suppose there were 12 canoes or 10 canoes. At the end of that day, perfect floating conditions. I remember saying to you, this is the longest period of quiet that I have ever had on the Missouri River, because you and I know enough to stop talking when it's sublime. But then I did ask you, I've been on it now 20 sometimes. You've been on it a dozen, I think.
Close to it, yes.
The question is, does it ever get blah? Does it ever just get routine? Do you ever think, yeah, here I am again. There's LaBarge, there's, etc. All these kind of stone monuments. And it doesn't quite, does it? But it does a little. And that's, I remember the first time that I was on that canoe trip, and you're wide-eyed with wonder. And then by the 10th time, you're still filled with wonder because it's magical, but you can't go home again. I mean, Thomas Wolfe was right, and Steinbeck knew that.
Right, and I think, if you do drop into conversation about something totally unrelated, it can slip by without being noticed. So, that is one of the valuable things about, just being quiet and taking it in.
I remember one year, I don't know if you were on this trip, when Woody brought his son, and they were in a canoe, and for like 3 days they talked about building projects and rivets and joists and lumber, and I finally shouted, "Stop! Do you have any idea where you are?" Because they could have been in the lobby of a Motel 6. They could have been in a coffee shop somewhere. They could have been in a Cenex convenience store in North Dakota. And there they were in one of the most beautiful places in the world, comparing notes on nail guns. I guess we all do that to a certain degree, right?
Right. At different places that are more meaningful to different people. But it's impossible, in my opinion, not to be wowed to some extent in the White Cliffs.
So let me ask you about that. So you've been to a lot of Steinbeck things. So together we've seen the original manuscript of The Grapes of Wrath. You've been to Monterey a zillion times, and to Doc's lab, to Point Lobos, to the house that's right there that he lived in a number of times. You've been on Route 66. What are the things you still want to do in the you are there sort of idea of Steinbeck?
I wouldn't mind visiting the Sag Harbor house, and I want to see and I've made arrangements to do this. I just haven't had the time, but I want to, it's not a physical place so much as I want to visit the archives at Stanford. I spent quite a bit of time back in the spring at the University of Texas. Just some of the things that you can hold in your hand there. I mean, there's a notebook, just, like you would buy at a Walmart, a spiral-bound notebook. And like Steinbeck wrote tortilla flat in this. And then you turn over a page, oh, here's one of the Red Pony stories. You turn over a few more pages, here's the chrysanthemums. It's just a single notebook. And it's just amazing. It's just amazing how in the zone he was at that time. You bring out the journal of a novel. That's sort of a different kind of you are there moment. But those are the ones at this point that really speak to me.
And of course, we got to get you to the Sea of Cortez, right, to Baja California, because one of your favorite Steinbeck books is The Sea of Cortez, the log of both really. There are two versions of it. But you've been a small part of the restoration project of the Western Flyer, the boat that took them there. I would love to get there somehow, and you must, because that's really maybe the prime Ricketts Steinbeck moment.
Right, and I'm hoping, we've talked about doing another Steinbeck retreat sometime. I'm hoping that, they provide opportunities for you to spend a night on the boat or have a meal on the boat, things like that. So I'm hoping we can at least do that.
You were there in Monterey when the boat was launched, when the after years of raising money and repairing it, it was in terrible shape when it was rediscovered. You were there with your wife Liz and some friends to watch that moment. That had to be a great moment too. That
was, and we were there up in Port Townsend when they first pulled the boat into the shipwrights building and began work on it. So if you have no interest in Steinbeck, if you have no interest in boats, still, if you're in the Monterey area, you should see this boat. It is just a piece of art at this point. Again, we're talking about Steinbeck generally, and my trip in my Airstream following Steinbeck, but I guess everyone gets it that we're Steinbeck enthusiasts, and also that there's no point in just doing this and not seeing the other Steinbeck-related opportunities when you're traveling this way. It would be ludicrous to get to, not to go to Tehachapi Pass or not to go to Williams, Arizona on Route 66. And so I've seen a lot of it. I'm also going to be in phase 3 going to New Orleans
which I'm very eager to do. I've been there many times, but never along these lines. And one of my hopes, Russ, is on phase 3 is to have a conversation with Ruby Bridges. She's the black woman who was just a girl back in 1960 when the public schools of New Orleans were being integrated. And as you know, Steinbeck wanted to see that. There was a huge ruckus going on, a protest and all sorts of horrible things, and he wanted to see it for himself, and he did, and he was so appalled by what he saw, these white racist women, he said, speaking a language that he had never in his life heard before, and he had heard a lot. He was so disgusted, so disenchanted, that he raced home after that, didn't he?
He did, and as you know, the first draft of Travels with Charley, he did not hold back on the language, on quoting what he saw and what he witnessed. And Viking told him they couldn't publish that. So he tried to get the horror across in other ways.
He does, and I mean his own sense of being just sickened. I mean, literally, physically sickened by it comes through loud and clear, doesn't it?
It does. There is a famous Norman Rockwell painting of Ruby Bridges that you can find online.
Of her, and one of the beauties of that painting is that we see her, but the marshals that are leading her in, we only see them up to their shoulders, and so the focus is on what he called this little mite, M-I-T-E, this little mite of a black child walking with great dignity into the school. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I was just going to mention I had been to that school once when it was in transition from being a school that was closed to what it is now. Speaking of New Orleans, in a sense, the end of your trek. I mean, I know you've got a little bit to do after that. So I just want to go on record here saying if you do manage to pull that Airstream all the way around the country and into New Orleans, I will meet you there. Liz and I will meet you there. We'll treat you to your first ever authentic bowl of gumbo.
Well, Russ, I've seldom taken so much abuse as I have taken from your lovely wife, one of the nicest people I've ever known in the world, about gumbo. And I'll get gumbo in Radford, Virginia. I'll get gumbo in the Outer Banks. I'll get gumbo somewhere, and I'll say it, and then she'll say, oh no, that's not gumbo. You haven't had gumbo. And so I say, put up or shut up on this thing. We're going to meet there. I can't wait. And then there's some logistical complications, but we will meet there. Then I'm going to do something that Steinbeck didn't do, but I'm going to do it in honor of Steinbeck, and I hope you will join me for parts of it at least. That is, I'm going to do a civil rights tour of Montgomery and Selma and Birmingham. Just to get serious for a minute, Russ, and I know we're about needing to take another break, but as we approach the 250th birthday of the country, which is really why I'm out doing this anyway, who are we now? Are we one nation or several? Do we have a narrative? Are we going to survive? What's the mood of the country? How do we feel about ourselves as we reach this milestone of 250 years since 1776? Because of that, because of Barack Obama's election, because of the George Floyd catastrophe in Minnesota, the killing of George Floyd, the Black Lives Matter movement, all these things that are happening. You've lived this more closely than I have because you've spent your life, much of it in Carolina, North Carolina. We have to have this conversation, don't we? We have to have a conversation about where we are with race. And it's such an unfinished, unresolved problem in American life that after all this time, there are still deep pockets of black poverty. There's still open racism in some quarters by white people. There's racial discrimination that's widespread. There's systemic racism in our courts and our economy and our policing and so on. We have to have this conversation now, and I feel really strongly about it. And I know you do too. And I hope that by going to Birmingham and Selma and Montgomery and Salisbury, where you live, where there's a Woolworths part of this, right?
In Greensboro, yes, just about 45 minutes away.
And I think you agree that this is we can't go on really until we address this in a more creative and satisfying way.
Oh, I agree, and I think that's why I'm still looking to that, which is in a sense, the post-Steinbeck part of the trip that you can do some of your best and most important work on this trip. So we can return to that. We do need to take another break right now. This is Listening to America with Clay Jenkinson, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Listening to America. This is Russ Eagle. We're talking with Clay Jenkinson, who's about to enter phase 3 of his trip around the country. And Clay, I've been reading your essays, and you wrote one about RV life and the way it's affecting you, and or as you called it, the Airstream life. And you were talking about how you've really developed conservation habits. You're not wasting food or water. You're stowing things properly. You're cleaning. You're cooking. You're limiting your number of books. So to me, this is a whole new Clay you're creating out there.
Wow. Wow. Thanks. You've seen my house. You've seen how I live.
And, I'm sort of half tongue-in-cheek, but half serious. I know you're planning in the years ahead to do this every year. So have you reached the point where you're more confident in your Airstream than you are in your bed at home?
Well, I'll tell you, first of all, it is true that I'm a maximalist in my life in North Dakota, as you know. I have 20,000 books, and my garage is basically a 3-car storage facility. And go ahead, shame me, Russ. But you have to be a minimalist when you're in a 23-foot tube. It's a very small number of square feet, and if things spin out of control, it's going to be a long trip. And you have to button things down every day because they really do fly and jostle around if they're not Velcroed in place. So I have learned these lessons. And of course, I have some advantages over Steinbeck because I only have maybe 15 books with me at any given phase, but I also have an iPad, which can have 300 books in it. And I have the internet. And so I have enormous advantages, which really, I have to admit, are not advantages merely of degree. They're advantages of kind. In other words, I try to imagine what it was like for Steinbeck Russ. He had a pickup that the seats didn't recline. He had power-assisted steering, not power steering. No air conditioning. He had a tube-type AM radio. He had a chemical toilet in his truck camper. That just sounds disgusting. I have great advantages. The roads are much better. The shocks are much better. I can't imagine the last phase of this in California and in Arizona without air conditioning. But you do have to be a minimalist, and it's been successful. The question that you would have, and I think it would be a legitimate question, is will that bleed over into my actual life? It has to a certain degree, and I'm hoping that it will be more. And I've actually this morning was down in my library, and I thought, I should probably get rid of a few thousand books. And then, of course, I sobered up. But it's been really amazing in that way, and there's something greatly joyous about it. So when I finished at Vail, I go 4 times a year to Vail to moderate these programs, and I was on my way home, and I got within a 1 day's run to Bismarck, and I thought, I'm not ready to go home. So I stopped at Ekalaka, Montana, at Medicine Rock State Park and spent one last night. And when I got home, I know this sounds like it's like a bourgeois version of a Jack London story, but when the rig is parked right out on the street in front of me, half the time I'm tempted to go out and sleep in it. There's just a kind of a lovely, wonderful, self-enclosed world to living in an Airstream. And of course, keep in mind, an Airstream is a very high-end, luxurious sort of RV, but nothing compared to what I'm seeing. I mean, I see these $400,000, $500,000, $600,000 bus RVs every single day when I'm out there, and they look at me with pity for my little 23-foot flying cloud. So it's been really an amazing experience, Russ, and I knew it would be. I've done a little of this before, but I love it out there, and I could see living out there 250 days a year. Of course, you couldn't stay in the northern latitudes. I'd have to be down in Texas or Arizona or Hemet, California, something like that. But it's been, one of my close advisors said, in 2 weeks, you'll be so sick of it, you'll just want to sell the thing. That hasn't happened at all. It's been a glorious experience, actually, and more than I could have dreamed. And it has awakened me to the magnificent beauty of this country. I mean, this is an incredibly beautiful country. And there is so much space where nothing is, which is empty. Even in New England, even in Massachusetts. I've been just blown away by the beauty of America. I've fallen in love with America again and again and again on this journey. So that's all great news, and I've cheered up. I know we're in trouble as a nation, but I've cheered up because the people I meet, they may be wearing the crust of their talking points on whichever cable channels they watch, but beneath that, there's something really solid and good and decent and generous and kind in the American spirit.
I was thinking about the three phases. I think the phase you just completed took place in country that you're most familiar with of the three. And yet, having spent many days out there myself, you can drive for days and see things you've never seen. It's like you said, the amount of space until you experience it is just something you can't imagine. I have seen, I do have some photographs of that chemical toilet that Steinbeck had in Rocinante, and it makes those things we use on the Salmon River look like luxury. Have there been any mishaps or incidents where you thought, I'm glad nobody can see me right now?
Oh, well, I don't know about that, but I think there have been 4, so let me quickly go through. Number 1, I interviewed Jay Perini, one of the great Steinbeck biographers in Middlebury, and he said, come on out to the farmstead. He has a little, professor's farmstead. And they gave me directions, and I came and I went through a wooden bridge, one of those classical New England wooden bridges. And it was so narrow that it clipped the awning on one side of the RV straight off. And so this is week 2. I blame Perini for this, truly, because when I left, I said, is there any other way out of here? And he said, oh yeah, there's a road, just go north. So I could have avoided that altogether. Then I was in Ohio, and I went to see another great Steinbeck scholar, Robert DeMott, in Athens, Ohio, and Google put me on the wrong path, and I came down this forest road, and it was so narrow, and it was getting tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter and deteriorating. And I thought, what happens if this road just dies? If the bridge is out or whatever? And I actually drew some paintings of it. It was terrifying, because if I had gotten stuck down there, it is literally the case that only a helicopter could have lifted that RV off of that road. But that turned out all right. Then 3 days later, I stopped at a rest stop. I smelled something funny, and I opened up, there's a battery container at the front end of the whole thing. And both of my batteries had melted. I mean, they'd melted down. And when I limped into an RV repair place, they said, you're lucky, because that's right next to your propane tanks. You're lucky to be alive. And so that took a few days for them to fix. And then I went out to the Olympic Peninsula, where a friend of mine has an organic farm, and he'd wired up this special thing for me because I was going to leave it to come to the Lewis and Clark trip. And he said, I'll plug her in. And then smoke came billowing out of the RV, and I thought, oh my God, the thing is burning up. And he had wired it wrong. We burned out some stuff. He luckily he had skills, so he was able to repair it all while I was on the Lewis and Clark Trail. But those have been the mishaps so far, and there will surely be more. The weak link, aside from the human factor in all of this, is the pickup. So the pickup is 2013, and when I was going up to Hatchby Pass, I thought, this is rough. I could blow a piston here or a ring. I need a little more power, so I'm going to have to think about that. I can make it work, and I'm not whining, but the weak link in the system at the moment is the vehicle hauling the Airstream. But the Airstream has been flawless, and it has this dimple now because of the bridge. I call it the Perini dimple, and when my book comes out, I will be attacking him as viciously as I can. But that's it. Those are the only adventures that could be called mishaps.
And you mentioned your drawings, your paintings. They keep coming. I counted last night. I think I have collected about 20 of them, so still hoping for...
Opinions vary.
Still hoping for, a gallery view on the website, and maybe even a live gallery show once you get off the road.
Well, the Guggenheim called, but I'm holding out for more. So the opinions vary. So people can go to the website and see some of this, and also the Facebook site. So the website is ltamerica.org. And then there are these drawings. And so I haven't done any for a little bit of time here, but some people have said, don't quit your day job. Well, actually, everyone has said, don't quit your day job. But some people say they're beautiful and charming and fun. And other people say, what's wrong with you? But I'm not going to stop. And when the book comes out, I'm sure that it'll be a collector's item.
Has to be, and you can raise quite a bit of funds, I think, selling the originals at some point.
You tell me. I mean, I think that they do evoke a certain kind of joy.
Oh, they do. I've been a big fan since the first one. I don't deny that I chuckle at a few of them, but I think they're valuable.
I could probably use some lessons in basic drawing, but very impressionistic to a certain degree, or crude if you want to put it that way. But I've had a great time with this, Russ, because it's an intensely visual experience. And of course, I take hundreds and hundreds of pictures per week, thousands really. The visualization of this journey is really important to me. And I know that 20 years from now, assuming I'm still alive, I'll look back and those drawings will really evoke some very important experiences. A, I love this country. I do love this country. B, we're going to survive. I've actually, and it's not just because President Biden stepped down, although that is certainly part of this. I think we were all feeling, not that it doesn't matter about your politics, but just a little dreary that two old men, one of them not firing on all cylinders, maybe both of them not firing, I don't know. But I think there was kind of a sense of, a kind of disillusionment, depression that we all felt like this can't be what America stands for. Two octogenarians duking it out. So there's something that comes from, I think, some fresh air in the political system. Although I was out there when Donald Trump was nearly assassinated. I was in the state of Washington, and it was chilling. It was a chilling moment. I listened on XM radio for hours. It was a very, very chilling moment because a quarter of an inch could have brought us into civil war, I think. So number one, I've cheered up. I think if you get out and see the country, you realize how fundamentally and essentially normal most Americans are, whatever their talking points are, but just how normal we are.
I think that's great to hear, but I also think it comes across in the essays and dispatches and so forth that you've submitted. So if people aren't reading those, I encourage them to.
That's what you bring this up, Russ. Every time I push send, I think of you because you know Steinbeck thoroughly. And I think, will this pass the Russ test? I know it won't pass the Liz test, but will it pass the Russ test? Is it accurate? Is it compelling? Are my thoughts insightful? Or are you shaking your head there and saying, not bad, but so I do think of you all the time, actually, and that's actually important and good because you need to have a reader in mind, and I have many readers in mind. It's been amazing. The response has been amazing all over the country, but it helps to have you there. And if I have a question, I know I can ask you in a text, and you'll look it up and tell me that that was 1953 or whatever it happens to be. That's very useful to me. But I've written so much. There's a book already if I wanted to edit it, and we get it that Steinbeck took literary license, and that doesn't bother either of us. But what is your sense of whether the book, the really beautiful and charming book, how well does it track, do you think, the experience?
Steinbeck always talked in terms of, he used the term true things. Is it a true thing? And that's what he went for in his books. And he didn't mean facts. He meant, is the overall mood, is what I'm getting across a true thing? And I think he felt that it was. And you're right, it is a charming book. And it was also written or experienced during a presidential election. So, I think he found out sort of the same thing, that when you get out there alone on the road, your perspective shifts. He was also in failing health. He was missing a wife that he depended on greatly. So he was coming from a little bit...
In all sorts of ways.
Right.
Emotionally, mostly.
But yes, I always thought that was the charm of the book. It is a true thing. And I've, just recently I've been able to read his correspondence with his editor at the time and seen what a struggle it was for him to turn it into what he felt like was a true thing. He was really as unsure of this book, I think, as any that he wrote. I've been an admirer of this book for 40 years now, and it's interesting to me that it was published the year that I was born, so it's always sort of a snapshot of that period to me.
So I agree with you about this, and I think it's really important to distinguish the book from the experience. The experience is in the book, but the book is not the experience. The book is it's a minor literary masterpiece by an eminent American author in the twilight years of his life, with some real doubts about his longevity, about his creative capacity, about whether he peaked too early and so on. I think that's what makes it really compelling. And my working title for my own book is The Confessions of John Steinbeck. But I think one thing that he discovered, and why, you're looking at the Covici correspondence, which you saw at the University of Texas and have now collected. I think one thing he discovered was that it's hard to listen to America. That, you can't really just drive around the country with whatever your intentions are and go to breakfast nooks and have people talk. When I've talked to people, they've almost invariably said the same thing. We're exhausted. We're just so tired of the situation, the sort of the right wing, left wing, MSNBC, Fox, the sort of the paralysis of our national political culture. They just say, we're just here to escape. And in Steinbeck's time, he had another problem because there were no RV parks. And so he was squatting on land, trespassing frequently enough. So I did not know when I started this how hard it would be to have conversations about America. I've had about 6 that were not just the usual kind of surface stuff. I've had a lot of MAGA experiences, I can tell you that, but that doesn't take you very far. And of course, the liberals are not in RV parks. The liberals are in national forest campgrounds or in tents, or not at all. But the country, he said the country was reluctant to talk about the situation then. This is Kennedy v. Nixon, the Cold War. And he had a hard time getting people to talk. And I think his sons are right, partly right, when they said there probably weren't that many actual conversations and encounters. I don't want to oversay that, but I think there's some truth to that. I have found it hard to get those conversations started. And when they do, I lock onto them like a magnet. What do you think?
It's been 20 years since I've made a trip like that, being in my case a cross-country drive, and just what I remember, it's going to be difficult to get yourself in a position to have meaningful conversations. There's been some criticism of Steinbeck in recent years about that trip, and I just think if people did what you're doing, which is try it themselves, they would find out that it's not as easy as it seems.
I'm not disappointed in any sense, but I am aware that I haven't spent a lot of time in cities. That would make a difference, I think. I've been essentially suburbia, exurbia, or rural America, so that's a different world. I haven't stayed in one place very long. You probably need to go to church. You probably need to stay after church for the church supper, make some friends, meet for coffee. But even then, I don't think that I would be like, oh, I've really learned about America. I think you learn by sensing it. You learn by intuiting it. And I'll just close with this. My intuition is that the country is weary and troubled, but that fundamentally that doesn't measure who we are, and that there is less division than appears, and that we are healthier than we think, and that the things we hear about, the school shootings and the crazy stuff that comes out of politicians' mouths and so on, is a small part of what it is to be America. I'm not Pollyanna, because I know this is not a great time in America. That's why I'm out there. But I think that you can sense, and I think Steinbeck did, he sensed the dynamics of America, the plasticization of things, the coming of homogenization, the restlessness of the American people, the fast food coming and the lowering of regional accents and regionalism and so on. He sensed it. You don't have to sit down with a microphone in front of everybody you meet to sense these things. And I think I've sensed what I have. I hope that it's accurate. But I'll say this, when I've had gumbo, real gumbo in New Orleans, I might just sell the rig right then, just that day, and say, the Grail quest is over. I have achieved, with Liz Eagle as my guide, I have achieved the Holy Grail.
It'll change your life. I wish we had more time, Clay. We're just getting started, but hopefully we can get back together soon and talk about not only phase 3, but other things, other adventures you have planned for the Airstream in the years ahead. In the meantime, we'll keep track of your whereabouts and goings on the LTA website and on social media. And we look forward to next time. And I know you will be back next week with another edition of Listening to America.